This is episode 43 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Nini Mikhaila, historical costumier, tailor, and author of The Tudor Tailor, Reconstructing 16th Century Dress. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
There are, in fact, a lot of documents about Shakespeare's life and about his work in the theatre. In the Public Record Office in London alone, there's over 50 documents that name Shakespeare and relate to his work for his acting company and indeed his life back in Stratford. There are local records as well. There are numerous testimonies from people who knew him, talking about his greatness as a writer.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare started out the son of a glovemaker in a small town in England and went on to become the greatest playwright the world has ever seen. How does one person accomplish so much? What did it take exactly for Shakespeare to become a genius? Was he born with particular gifts and talents no one else has seen or heard of again in the last 400 years? Or has our love of Shakespeare inflated his reputation beyond what it deserves? One man who has argued in the public arena specifically for Shakespeare the man is our guest this week, Sir Jonathan Bate. Knighted in 2015 for services to literary scholarship and higher education, Jonathan Bate is also a British academic, biographer, critic, and scholar. He specialises in Shakespeare, Romanticism, and Ecocriticism as the Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford, Provost of Worcester College, Oxford, Gresham Professor of Rhetoric, and Honorary Fellow of Creativity at Warwick Business School. His most recent book is the subject of our interview today, and that is titled The Genius of Shakespeare. In his book, Sir Jonathan examines the life of William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, to outline how one man becomes a genius. We're delighted to have him here with us today to discuss some of the answers he discovered while writing his book. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Cassidy.
Obviously, William Shakespeare isn't the only man to have written great plays in the 16th to 17th century England, but I do think he wins the title of most well-known by a wide margin. Why do you think Shakespeare's legacy has lasted so long when there are so many others literally right beside him during his lifetime that have fallen into relative obscurity?
Although Shakespeare and his plays were widely admired in his own lifetime, there were other dramatists who were equally admired, and indeed in many ways more admired. If we could get in a time machine and go back to the year 1616, when Shakespeare died, educated people would probably say the most important, the greatest dramatist of the time was Shakespeare's friend and rival Ben Jonson. Others might say that the great writer who died in that year of 1616 was a man called Francis Beaumont, part of a writing team, Beaumont and Fletcher, who was hugely admired, actually buried in Westminster Abbey. So it's undoubtedly the case that Shakespeare was one of a constellation of great writers for the stage in his own time. And 2 or 3 generations after his death, he was still really thought of as the equal of people like Jonson and Beaumont and Fletcher. It was only in the 18th century, the 1700s, 150 years after his death, that people began to say, yeah, Shakespeare is the supreme genius. Now, the reasons for that are multifold. I think in the end, they're to do with the great variety of his works. On the whole, Ben Jonson was very successful in comedy, but not in tragedy. Christopher Marlowe, one of the names we do still remember, successful in tragedy, not in comedy. Shakespeare seemed to have the full package: comedy, tragedy, history, pastoral, romantic plays. So it's the range of his work. Also, I think the sheer range of subject matter within that work. Other dramatists wrote powerfully about politics or the family or love. Shakespeare wrote about them all. He seemed to write about every aspect of human experience. There were also, I think, particular reasons in the evolution of theatre history and cultural history why he outstripped the others. One, for example, was the power of his writing about women. He produced more incredibly rich female characters than any other dramatist. And of course, it wasn't until the late 17th, early 18th century that women started playing those roles on stage. And so as women became an increasingly important part of the theatre and the culture, because of his ability to see from a female point of view, he outstripped his peers.
Well, I wonder, for all of these peers, for people like Shakespeare and Francis Beaumont and the other people you've mentioned, was it normal for these playwrights to collaborate together to produce a play?
Yes, it was. Yeah. The normal mode of writing was a little bit like script writing for television or screenwriting for Hollywood in modern times. You would have a team of writers. You might have a lead writer, but you would have others contributing and revising. Early in Shakespeare's career and towards the end of his career, that's exactly what he did. He began his career effectively as a rewrite man. There would be an existing script and he would rework it and make it better. He also wrote collaboratively with other dramatists in those early plays. Then at the end of his career, perhaps as he was thinking about stepping back from the theatre, maybe for health reasons, maybe because he had just made enough money, got bored, we don't know why, but towards the end of his career, he also collaborates. But what is striking about Shakespeare is in the middle period of his career, the great decade between about 1595 and 1605, when nearly all his greatest plays were written. During that period, he was a solo writer. He worked on his own. And that is very, very unusual for the time.
Well, recently, Jonathan participated in a public debate hosted by the De Vere Society with Alexander Waugh, who, for the uninitiated, is part of the Oxfordian group Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Now, that debate was about what's called the authorship question. And you can't see Jonathan making a face as I ask this, but before I do want to ask you to please briefly explain, before I ask you some specific questions about this, explain for us what we mean when we say authorship question.
Absolutely. What we don't mean is what you and I have just been talking about, Cassidy. If people who have really worked on the theatre in the period know that the predominant form of writing was collaborative. So for professional scholars, the authorship question is which little bits of a late play like Pericles or an early play like Titus Andronicus were written by Shakespeare and which were written by another professional dramatist, such as George Peele in one case and Wilkins in the other. But that's not what the authorship controversy means for the people I call the conspiracy theorists. What they believe is that because Shakespeare didn't go to university, because he only had a provincial grammar school education, he couldn't possibly have been learned enough to write all these plays. And that plays that show such a profound understanding of the world of the court and political intrigue couldn't have been written by a commoner. They must have been written by an aristocrat who was familiar with the court. And therefore, the plays weren't really written by William Shakespeare, the actor from Stratford upon Avon in the Midlands of England. He was just the front man, that really behind him there was a powerful aristocrat, maybe Francis Bacon, the Earl of St Albans, maybe Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, that they were really writing the plays and then quietly putting them into Shakespeare's hands. That's a conspiracy theory that has a long and I think interesting history, although only a history of just over 100 years. Nobody doubted for the first 250 years after Shakespeare's death that the actor from Stratford upon Avon did write the plays. But rather just as he became regarded as the supreme genius, became a kind of global cultural celebrity, people began having conspiracy theories. it kind of inevitably happens, doesn't it? With when you have something that is incredibly famous, you'll get a conspiracy theory. Think of the assassination of JFK, the death of Marilyn Monroe, the moon landing. Somehow, once you have great fame, you have an appetite for conspiracy.
So it comes along with your bobblehead doll, I guess. You reach these levels of fame and you get certain aspects that come along with it. I do find it interesting that for William Shakespeare, he seems to be attacked almost in particular because there's a long list of people in history who started from nothing, went on to greatness of astounding proportions, and people tend to laud these stories as incredible and promote them as motivational and inspirational. But when it comes to William Shakespeare, recently he's become this target for questioning just what was he able to do. And I've even heard some people question whether or not he existed. Was he even a real person? And obviously this show is called That Shakespeare Life, so you know where I land on that. But what do you think made Shakespeare this kind of target?
You're right, Cassidy, but it's very curious in a way, and especially as the great majority of the conspiracy theorists are Americans. And America is supposed to be the great country of opportunity, where you can go from a log cabin to the White House. So you would have thought Shakespeare would be celebrated for coming from a humble provincial background. His father was a shopkeeper. He was mocked when he first came to London by the dramatists who were more educated, the so-called university wits, the dramatists like Marlowe and Robert Greene, who had been to Oxford and Cambridge, who had that education. They mocked Shakespeare as a kind of country bumpkin, a village idiot. They were furious that this man from a humble background from the provinces was stealing their thunder, rewriting their works, making money, becoming more famous than them. You'd have thought that Americans would celebrate that. But you're right, somehow he's attracted these conspiracy theorists who want the glamour of aristocracy to be attached to the plays.
And I know scholarship, especially Shakespeare scholarship, is founded a lot on asking questions. When you investigate anything, you start by asking a question and seeking out what you can find out in terms of an answer, even a partial one. So is it legitimate to consider the authorship question something worth asking in terms of studying Shakespeare?
Well, it absolutely is, because all scholarship needs to be grounded in evidence. And it is the case that there are some infuriating gaps in the evidence about Shakespeare's life. But then there are equally great, probably greater gaps in the evidence about the lives of every other dramatist of the period. We need to remember that the theatre was not a respectable profession in Shakespeare's time. Therefore, people didn't carefully keep records of the lives and works of theatre people. There are, in fact, a lot of documents about Shakespeare's life and about his work in the theatre. In the Public Record Office in London alone, there's over 50 documents that name Shakespeare and relate to his work for his acting company and indeed his life back in Stratford. There are local records as well. There are numerous testimonies from people who knew him, talking about his greatness as a writer. There are gaps. There are questions that we can't answer. We don't know exactly why he left Stratford and went to London. We don't know exactly when his career in the theatre began. We don't know why he went back to Stratford and didn't write so much towards the end of his career. And of course, the moment you have those holes, people start wanting to fill them in with conjecture and speculation.
I really want to know what motivated you to decide to accept the invitation to participate in the authorship debate that you were a part of, mostly because I speak to a lot of academics and not very many of them would have engaged this conversation. What motivated you to go? What are you friends with them, or what did that invitation look like?
Yeah, I mean, three reasons really. One is Alexander Waugh happens to be a good friend of mine. We have a private agreement that we never get into the authorship debate when we're together socially. But he gave me the challenge of having the debate publicly. And I thought, I don't want to shy away from that challenge.
Well, you did very well. I mean, I was
well,
impressed.
Thank you. The second thing was, one of the things that I always used to say about the authorship debate, which I've been engaging with for many, many years, partly because I had a very brilliant but slightly mad school teacher who was a believer in the Earl of Oxford theory. And one of the things I always used to say is that no actor takes it seriously, because all actors know that the person who wrote these plays was an actor. The central metaphor that Shakespeare uses again and again in his work is of life as a play. And his plays are shot through with a knowledge of the technical requirements of the stage, shot through with an insider's knowledge of how you put a scenic structure together. They could only have been written by an actor. So I always used to say, no great actor has ever doubted that Shakespeare, the actor, was the playwright. But then lo and behold, in the course of my career, a couple of great actors, notably Mark Rylance.
I was going to say that.
Yeah. Well, Mark I regard as, one of the best Shakespearean actors of my lifetime. But he is a doubter, as is Sir Derek Jacobi, another distinguished Shakespearean actor. And I knew those two would be there in the audience. And I thought, they need to hear the true story. And I had a good chat with Mark Rylance afterwards, and I'm not sure he really doubts as much as he pretends to. So it was to confront the actors. And then the third thing was a really important point, that there is a real danger that if all of us academics say, this is a non-question, we are not going to debate it, we are just going to have debates among ourselves about the interpretation of Shakespeare's plays, the technicalities of the stage at the time, then we're going to leave the public arena to the conspiracy theorists. And I'm going to go on getting into taxis throughout the world and having the first question that is asked of me, so you're a Shakespeare man. Did the guy from Stratford write the plays? We need the truth to be out there, especially in the age of the internet. The internet's an amazing thing, but of course the problem with the internet is that there's nobody there to tell the naive user which are the websites based on true scholarship and which of the ones based on conspiracy theories. Funnily enough, I'm doing some other work here at ASU, and one of the things I was Googling for last night was that famous photograph taken by the Apollo 8 astronaut of Earthrise, of the Earth there in the blackness of space, the beautiful colors of the Earth. And the first website that I went to try to pull the photo was one that had an elaborate theory about how man never went to the moon and how that photograph was faked, which is, of course, complete nonsense. But that was the first website that came up. Similarly, with the Shakespeare conspiracy theory, Google on Shakespeare authorship, and you don't know what you're going to get. So that's why you do need hard-headed, historically minded scholars to be out there just pushing for the truth, the facts.
Now, you mentioned Pericles, and I've heard it suggested that Cymbeline was also a play that Shakespeare collaborated with other writers on, and that this collaboration was normal. And I love your comparison to modern day theater, because yes, there's hardly anything more communal than a theater experience. So it does take a lot of people to pull something like that off, and it's not really a surprise. It would for Shakespeare as well. But when we look at the fact that he collaborated with other authors, is that a reason to think he should not be given credit for writing great plays?
Absolutely not, because one of the things that's very striking when you look at the collaborative plays is that the bits by Shakespeare are much better than the bits by other authors. A good example would be his early play, Titus Andronicus, where there is now strong evidence that he was either working with or revising an earlier script by a dramatist called George Peele, and that the bulk of the first act of the play, as it survives, is as Peele wrote it, and the rest is by Shakespeare. But what you find when you see Titus Andronicus in the theatre, or when you read it, is the first act of the play is actually distinctly clunky in its construction. It's got a laboured quality to it. But then the moment Shakespeare takes over, there's a kind of fluidity to the writing and to the staging that just reveals how good he is. Similarly with the late play Pericles, where he seems to have taken over in the third act, taken over an unfinished play by a writer called Wilkins. And again, the sheer quality of the writing, the plotting, the characterization is just so much better.
So obviously Shakespeare's works prove him to be the genius we've given him credit for being. But when we study his life and his works, we look at him as a man and discover he was indeed human after all. And one of the aspects your book, The Genius of Shakespeare, touches on is answering the question of what does this perspective on Shakespeare's humanity teach us about what it means to be a genius?
Yeah, I think that's right, because the striking thing about Shakespeare's life is, compared with the lives of his other dramatists, who were often getting into trouble with the censorship of their plays, or getting into, in the case of Marlowe, a dangerous world of espionage, it seems. Shakespeare lived a rather dull life. He was clearly a very effective businessman working in his theatre company. He made money, and he eventually went back to his small provincial town to die. And you think, how can someone who had this rather colourless life have written such colourful plays? And I think the answer to that is that often genius comes more through observation, through watching and listening and thinking, than it does through action. Shakespeare was undoubtedly an extraordinarily astute reader. He, in his grammar school education, was first exposed to the great poems and historical works of classical antiquity. And throughout his life, he read books, he saw other people's plays, and he had an incredible capacity to absorb everything that he read, everything that he saw, and to turn it anew into a creative act of his own. One of the anecdotes about Shakespeare that has a very good sort of theatrical pedigree going right back to his own time. It's a story that often he was invited to go out drinking with the other dramatists down at the Mermaid Tavern. And he'd say, oh, no, I'm going to stay home, I've got a headache. You do have the sense that he perhaps wasn't the most sociable man. And I think that's because I'm seeing him sort of sitting quietly in the corner, watching, listening, absorbing, and living in his imagination. So in a way, there's a kind of correlation between the very quietness and dullness of his life and the extraordinary richness and range of his imagination.
Well, as we've introduced this idea of the authorship question to a few people, I think, I would like to ask you to help us do exactly what you suggested of cutting through the clutter that's available online and recommend for us, in addition to your book, The Genius of Shakespeare, which we will link to in today's show notes, what were some of the resources that you used that you might recommend that we look at to learn more on what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare?
Yeah, a really good starting point. The Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., the greatest collection of Shakespeareana in the world. They now have a website called Shakespeare Documented, which has facsimile reproductions of early documents, transcriptions of them, extracts from early witnesses, and all the kind of original core evidence is there. So I think that would be a great starting point. There's also a terrific book by, I don't know, someone you may have talked to, the Columbia University Shakespeare scholar James Shapiro, has written a very good book called Contested Will about the history of the authorship controversy and the reasons for it. And that would be a book, in addition to the chapter on the controversy in my Genius of Shakespeare book, that would be a good place to go to.
Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I'm glad I've got the complete works of Shakespeare, obviously, because otherwise it would be that. I think the book that I'm going to take, it might surprise you a bit. It's going to be the collected poems of Wallace Stevens. I love poetry, and of course Shakespeare is the greatest of all poets. We've talked about his plays, but let's not forget the sonnets and the narrative poems that he writes. But there's a lot of other poetry that I love. The thing about Wallace Stevens is the poetry has a kind of mysterious quality. I never quite know what he's getting at. It's very, very beautiful. It's thought-provoking, but you can read it again and again and again and find new depths in it and find yourself puzzling about what he means. And I think that's what I need in my Desert Island books, because I'm going to be there on my own for a very long time. So it's no good having, a great novel that you can read once, read twice, and more or less know it inside out. You need poetry because of its depths. When Shakespeare's first folio of his collected works, which I've got on the Desert Island, was published, his friends and fellow actors, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who put it together, and how on earth could Shakespeare not have been Shakespeare, given that his fellow actors from the acting company were the ones who edited his works. They said, read him, therefore, and again and again. And that's what you need on a desert island, something you can read again and again. And for me, that's the poetry of Wallace Stevens.
Absolutely. Excellent choice. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Okay, well, two things. I've just finished a book which is on Shakespeare again, and it's called How the Classics Made Shakespeare. It begins with Shakespeare's education, his education in the literature of classical antiquity. But it goes much more widely than that, because, of course, his was a time when everybody was fascinated by ancient Rome, classical antiquity. London, in many ways, modelled itself on Rome. So it's a book about Shakespeare as a classical author. And I wrote it and I'm passionate about it because I think one of the challenges facing those of us who love Shakespeare now is that, of course, Shakespeare frequently refers to the myths and stories and histories of classical antiquity in the knowledge that most of his audience would know what he's talking about. But now, as our knowledge of the classics declines, those references become less obvious. So it's a bit of an act of kind of a recuperation of a classical tradition that is rapidly disappearing. But then the second thing that I'm doing, and that my residency here in Phoenix at Arizona State University is based on, is I've always been very interested in the contribution that great literature can make to debates about our ecological crisis today, the environmental crisis. And so I'm getting to work on a book in that territory, really seeing what we humanities scholars can bring to the table as we address all the problems of climate change, overconsumption, pollution, the future of our planet.
Well, those sound like fascinating projects. We'll definitely be looking forward to seeing those come to fruition. Thank you so much for spending your time here with us this afternoon. It's been a joy talking with you.
It's been a pleasure, Cassidy.
To get the link to Jonathan's latest book, The Genius of Shakespeare, as well as the other resources he mentions in today's episode, please visit the show notes. That's CassidyCash.com/episode 43, CassidyCash.com/EP43. Don't forget, you can support the work we do here at That Shakespeare Life by shopping at CassidyCash.com and checking out the link to our sponsors. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.